It's my pleasure to introduce this event at the beginning. We're really, as I mentioned before, happy that this is happening here today. I'm really excited for the book, and I'm also really excited that one of the Writer Center's co-founders is here today to be our interviewer. And I'm going to introduce Merrill Leffler, who will be our interviewer. Merrill Leffler has had a varied professional and literary life. A student of physics, he worked at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in rocketry that carried scientific experiments into orbital altitudes. He left NASA in his late 20s to study literature, as most of us do. We start in rocket science and go to literature, and went on to teach at Maryland and the US Naval Academy. At the Academy, he and his colleague Al Lefkowitz germinated the idea of the Writer Center, which I'm not quite here. This is my office at home, but it's a really wonderful building you should check out as well. And the Writer Center, though, originally started because they learned that the Park Service at Glen Echo was offering free space to nonprofit arts organizations. Leffler, who had been publishing Dryad literary magazines since the 60s and then books from Dryad Press, such as this book, left university teaching for science writing at Maryland's Sea Grant program, which focuses on research and extension on Chesapeake Bay. So Merrill, thank you again so much for joining us for this. And I'm going to hand off to you now to begin the official proceedings for the evening.
Well, thank you. And I'm welcome. I can welcome everybody else here on behalf of the Writer Center. It sounds strange to me since it's been a while. I used to be at the Writer Center a great deal, especially in the first 5-10 years teaching workshops, or I won't say teaching, but holding workshops in poetry, in writing and in reading books of poetry. But we're not here for that today. We're here to talk about Ken Langer's new novel, A Nest for Lalita. Do we have a photograph of that? Can you see that? I would mention as a plug, you could go to dryadpress.com and you could find the book there as well. So what we're going to do is, I've spoken to Ken. We haven't rehearsed anything, but we've talked about what we thought would be interesting. Of course, the book, the plot, characters, and so forth. But also, because we're at the Writer Center, to talk about the writing of the novel as well, and the editing, and what went into it. And because Ken has worked on this for several years, at least. So, but let's get started with the book. I think, we can talk about, first of all, just a summary of it. The title of the book is A Nest for Lalita. It's not Lolita, but it's Lalita. Do I have that pronounced correctly?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Lolita is my next book.
Yeah, so maybe you can just give us to begin with a summary, so we have a context for where we go from here.
Yeah. Very simply, the book starts in 2005, and we're talking about, it starts with Meena Kaul, who is the protagonist, or one of two protagonists, and she's riding high. She has been appointed about 5 years ago as executive director of Behera House. And Behera House is a safe haven for women who have survived domestic violence. This is in India, a fictitious town in India called Sompur. It's been 5 years, and this home or shelter, whatever you want to call it, is very successful. They want to expand. And Mr. Behera, who's an industrialist behind the whole enterprise, he has committed the money for a big expansion, really to build a campus with a community center. But unfortunately, the stock market crashes. Of course, something has to happen in the first few pages, right? The stock market crashes, and he isn't able to fund this campus. And who should step in but the ultra right-wing Hindu party, which I call the Hindu Democratic Party. And Meena, to make a long story short, she's forced to accept the money from this Hindu party, which increasingly puts a very, very tight grip around her neck. And really that becomes the major conflict, at least on a macro level, that this right-wing Hindu party is trying to use Behera House for its own political end, for its own political means, to win women's votes, because their secret agenda, their not so obvious agenda, is to turn the clock back on women. So they're pretty sneaky. And Meena knows this, and she tries very hard to extricate herself from this party. In the meantime, Simon, an American, we call him a starchitect, a very, very famous green architect, is commissioned to come to Sompur and to design this community center for the new campus. Well, needless to say, Simon falls for Meena. She's very intelligent, she's very attractive, and is immediately drawn into this perilous world of Meena's in terms of Indian politics. I won't say more because I had a short 1-minute book trailer done, which can explain this with images and much more eloquently than I can. So Zach, if you don't mind running that video for 1 minute, then we can move on.
Director of Behera House. Meena Kaul is the director of Behera House, a safe haven for survivors of domestic violence. When the stock market crashes, Meena is forced to accept funding from the ultra-right-wing Hindu Party. But her worst fears come to pass when the Hindu Party wins the national election and starts chipping away at women's rights, drawing Behera House into its political web. When Simon Bliss, America's top green architect, comes to India to design the new community center, he falls for Meena and is quickly sucked into her perilous world of Indian politics. To win her affection, he takes on corrupt politicians, shady priests, and crooked businessmen. Can Meena and Simon survive the Hindu Party's ruthless political games and save Behera House?
All right, well, that's much more fun than the talk, so you get to see that at least.
Well,
Merrill, go ahead.
This gives us a very brief gateway, but there's also more going on here. I'm coming in with a lot of knowledge, having read this book several times over the course of its being published.
Right.
So, there's murder, there's an investigation, and so forth. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of the feel for that.
Well, why don't we start with the title? Because I think people would like to know why the book is entitled A Nest for Lalita, and then we can fill in, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
People are always asking me, what is the title? What is this all about? And it really begins with a prologue, which happens 30 years before the main events of the book. Lalita is a very poor sweeper in the industrial house or the company of Mr. Behera. Now, Mr. Behera at this point is a young man. He's not the head of the company yet. His father is the head. He's the son of the CEO, and he likes to paint. So occasionally he'll draw in one of his employees to model, to sit for him. Well, he takes a liking to this sweeper, this young sweeper who's exquisite, whose name is Lalita. And she does sit for him with some tragic consequences. She is given by Behera, Mr. Behera gives her a golden necklace, which was part of the outfit that he dressed her in when she sat for him. And this golden necklace she takes home and hides from her husband, but her husband comes and he comes home drunk and in a jealous rage. He finds the necklace. And I think you can probably imagine what happens after that. If you don't mind, I'd like to read.
Maybe you can read some of that then.
I'll just read a little bit of that prologue to give you a sense. It's a difficult portion of the book, but if you've gotten through this much, there won't be anything worse in terms of what happens to people in the book. So I'm starting with when the husband comes into their very modest home, shack, whatever you want to call it, and he's looking at a trunk, and he says, "What the hell is this?" He growled, picking up a folded. He kicks the trunk, and and some content falls out, picking up a folded silk sari from the wet dirt. The necklace tumbled out. Ram's face turned red. He looked like a Rakshasa, a wrathful deity full of bloodlust. You tramp, where did you get this? I bought it with money I've saved up. Stupid liar. He seized her by the hair and pushed her against the wall. Then he started rummaging through the items. And what's this, he roared, holding a pen and ink drawing of Lalita dressed in a shiny green sari. The gold necklace hung from her neck. He slammed the drawing into her face, crushing her nose. It's a drawing, what do you think? It's you, isn't it, wearing a silk sari and that motherfucking gold necklace. Who did this? Sri Behera, the boss's son. He likes to draw. He draws all of his employees. I don't know why. Even scum sweepers like you. He gave you the necklace, didn't he? No, I told you. He's fucking you in the ass, isn't he, you wench? Ram grabbed the tin of kerosene near the mud stove. He caught hold of Lalita's arm and dragged her behind the hut. She squirmed and struggled, finally freeing herself. She ran like the devil, but he tackled her in the neighbor's field. He doused her with kerosene from head to toe. No, no, she screamed, her lithe body flailing like a caught fish. Ram jammed his knee onto her legs and chest, pinning her to the ground. With his arms free, he lit a match and tossed it onto her. Then he jumped back. In seconds, Lalita turned into a living torch. She screamed, running this way and that, until she collapsed in a patch of yellow flowers. A woman rushed out of a nearby shed with a bucket of water, but it was too late. Well, it's a pretty heavy opening, I'll admit, but it sets the stage because after this, Mr. Behera, who's feeling very, very guilty because he gave her the necklace, he vows one day to build a home for women who've suffered similar fates, or not well, who survived similar fates of Lalita's. Well, it took him 30 years, but he finally built Behera House. And when Simon is commissioned to design this community center, he builds within the community center a room which is like a nest, because he wants these women to feel nourished or cared for. And that becomes the nest for Lalita symbolically. Of course, Lalita is no longer there, but all the women who are residents of Behera House.
Well, maybe, well, a couple of things, Ken.
Yeah.
That prologue that you've read, which is really very tough, but it's also that entry, as you say, we don't see anything about Lalita again because that's the generating force of the direction of the novel. Right. But maybe you could, so in designing this, the commission to design a place for these women, maybe you could just give us a sense, and of course we want to hear the writing, we want to hear the parts of the novel. Yeah. How does he come about or describe, this so-called bird's nest?
Right. Well, let me start by saying something which I think is important here, that Mr. Behera, when he's describing to Simon what he wants for a community center, he constantly says, I want you to make a signature building, a building like the bird's nest, which is the stadium, the Chinese called their Olympic stadium for the 2008 Olympics. I don't know if you recall, it was called the Bird's Nest. And it was in the shape of, this wrought iron, this steel that was like a nest. And he keeps saying, I want it like a bird's nest. Well, Simon finally figures out, even before Meena does, Meena hasn't realized it, that he really wants, he's not just saying he wants a signature building that will bring international attention like the bird's nest did in China, but he wants an actual bird's nest. And in fact, even Behera doesn't realize what he's saying at the time. Let me read you just a short passage where Simon is actually, this is much further in the book, along in the book, where he's actually giving his presentation of the design to Mr. Behera and to Meena. And now the moment you've been waiting for. This is in the middle of his presentation. He's already done the basics. Simon said with a smile. He clicked the remote. The bird's nest. Meena clenched her fists in anticipation. This feature would either impress Mr. Behera like nothing he'd ever seen before or fall flat on its face. A small round room appeared on the screen. The walls were covered in deep blue velvet. The floor looked like a giant cushion. Simon kept pressing the remote, and one by one, streaks of light started to emerge from the walls inside the walls. Going in every direction, they looked like twigs illuminated under a full moon. Simon continued to click, and the number of lines slowly multiplied until the entire room resembled a bird's nest under the moonlight. All of a sudden, a constellation appeared on the ceiling. It was Sagittarius, Lalita Devi's sign. Meena looked over at Behera, whose mouth had dropped in awe. This room, said Simon, is deep within the ground floor of the center. Here, women can sit comfortably in total darkness, or using the remote, they can illuminate the walls and create their own nests. Behera scrunched his eyes as if fighting back tears. The bird's nest is a sanctuary, Simon said, a sacred place, like the inner sanctum of a Hindu temple. It is a place of comfort and healing.
So you write a good deal. Of course, as you say, it's the novel is set in India, and as we'll see, you get into a good deal of detail. Maybe you could just, I just want to back up for a moment, and to talk about, it occurs to me just at this moment when Zach was, referring to my varied career, going from, physics and engineering into teaching, and then leaving teaching and writing about environmental issues in the Chesapeake Bay. You've had this a varied career that starts with Sanskrit. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of a background about that.
my sordid background. Well, yeah, I do have a PhD in Sanskrit, and that is in a sense what drove me to write this novel and set it in India, of course. I would like to say that India is in my blood, but it's probably more like chicken tikka is in my blood, given the amount of Indian food I eat every week. I spent a lot of time in India doing first a junior year in college in Benares or Varanasi, the holy city. And then I did a postdoc after my PhD, which took me to Pune, India for 2 years. I sat at the feet of a Sanskrit guru, if you will. But then I did leave the field. I found it a little bit too academia, too constricting for me. And I went into international development and ultimately into business and started a green building consulting company. So it was a long career. After I'd sold my company, I was trying to figure out what to do, and I was feeling a little bit too much like a barbecue dad, in the suburbs. My kids were still pretty small. So I decided to write this novel and set it in India. And for me, Merrill, it was a way of actually getting back to India when I couldn't really go there and live there. I had a family. It was a way of sorting out all of the experiences I've had in my all those sojourns in India, which add up to more than 5 years. Very therapeutic, I have to say.
So I'm thinking about Meena, for the moment, and building this home. How did you go from that, living in India, for example, for 5 years, actually, and also being married to an Indian woman, but how did you go to coming up with this idea itself? Is there some kind of straight line, or how did it occur?
I don't know if this answers your question, but I'll try. When I did my PhD many years ago, and it was on Sanskrit love poetry. And the women in Sanskrit love poetry are inevitably very beautiful, very timid, and very forgiving. After about 10 years after my PhD, I was living in India with my ex-wife, and she was Indian, she is Indian. And we socialized with many, many Indian women, especially, who were social activists. And they were all working on, most of them were working on issues that related to women, domestic violence, acid attacks, gang rape, all the really terrible things that women suffer in India. I mean, around the world as well, but in India. And for this period with my wife, my ex-wife, forced me to reflect on my earlier scholarship and how patriarchy in India, which is very strong in India even today, how it affects the real women, how it affected the real women of the time that this poetry that I was writing about earlier, and how it affects the women of today. And I realized after so many years that I wasn't really asking myself some important questions. I was kind of blinded, if you will, to the reality of women. I was in this fantasy world of beautiful women, beautiful, timid, lovely women of this poetry. So I jokingly say that writing this novel is a kind of penance, a way of atoning for my being blind to some of the pain that women have and are suffering in India. If nothing else, atonement might be too strong a word, but if nothing else, I think it reflects my trying at least to take a stand against a very male-dominated society.
This is a novel that one might expect being written by a woman, not a white American male. I mean, your qualifications, you've given some of those, in effect, some of those qualifications from having lived in India, being married to an Indian woman, studying Sanskrit and Indian culture. So I guess you feel qualified.
Well,
when feminists come after you.
I can't say. I mean, one writes in some sense for oneself. And I wrote this novel. I hope that my experience in India is deep enough that people won't shy away from reading the novel. And I hope they won't throw it out the window once they see some of the characters, who are one in particular who's a bit misogynist. But I can only say that I hope that people will read it and feel that it reflects India, a side of India that is very, very important and very real, even though I am a white, I can't help that. I am a white American male. But I feel like I'm bringing people in this book to an India which they could never get from, going on a tour or educational tour, museum tour. We're meeting people and we're going to temples and different scenes, into the living rooms, into the dining rooms, of even the bedrooms of men and women that you just don't see in as a tourist. And so, at least for people in the West, I'm hoping this brings something new to them.
I think this may be a segue, perhaps, into speaking about, or you're talking, and maybe giving us some examples of some of these characters. I mean, you mentioned that there are two protagonists, and that would be Meena and Simon. But there's also significant characters in Kesh and Gita, and Gita, who is very strong. Talk about feminists. She's
right
beyond that. So maybe you could, why don't we start with Meena, for example, who is the alluring, very competent woman who's caught up in this problem of in order to go ahead with this center.
Well, Meena and Simon are both very, highly professional, highly serious people, middle-aged man and woman, who are progressive, but they're not revolutionary. It's Gita, you mentioned Gita. Gita is Meena's deputy, who's gay and very, very radical in her thinking about how India should move forward, and anti-men, if you will. And then there's Keish, Meena's husband, who's almost bipolar in that he is very much, he comes across as a misogynist, but at the same time, and he cracks terrible jokes. They're not politically correct, they're offensive. I mean, he is really an equal opportunity offender, this guy. He spares no one. But at the same time, we'll get to Keish, but at the same time, I'll say that he is also the top green architect in India. And he's the one who's leading the crusade in India against climate change. And so, he's a character that, I thought at first people would, especially women, would come across Keish and just say, I'm not reading this book. He's just too awful. He's too much of a misogynist. But if you look deeper, he's got another side. I don't want to say that excuses his misogynist wisecracks, but it certainly makes him a more complex person. Now, Meena and Simon, I want to kind of keep them together. They're almost like anchors. You might say in the nucleus of an atom, where Gita and Keish are very energetic characters who are spinning around and changing orbits and releasing energy. I mean, in the case of Gita, that energy is usually a tirade against men. And with Keish, it could be anything. But Meena is a very stable person. And she's very troubled by Keish's behavior, because Keish gets sucked into all sorts of things that you might say are symptomatic of traditional India, are symptomatic of the India that is full of courtesans and that old era. In fact, Keish is the son of an ex-Maharaja, and at one point, the narrator says it's almost as if Keish is trying to out-Maharaj his Maharaja father. He is pulled toward that way of life, but at the same time, he's pushing the envelope on green buildings against climate change. So, I know I'm giving you more than you bargained for.
Well, why don't you give us a taste for some of this, and some, maybe
right.
some.
I want to just read the beginning of the book, because that's where it all starts. And it starts with Meena, and she's driving home after work. And I'll give you a sense of her personality. Meena dreaded the evening commute. Sompur's streets were a dusty, tangled mess. Nothing like New Delhi with its wide boulevards and stately bungalows, which was where they moved from. The roads were far too narrow for the crush of cars, trucks, and scooter rickshaws, let alone bullock carts and bony cows. They were clogged like an old man's arteries. And why do these people think there's one lane when there are three? But the commute was a small price to pay for her dream job. No one in her master's program at Delhi University was already heading up a non-governmental organization. Stopping for a group of men who had stumbled into the street, she worried about her husband. Keish has not been himself since they moved there 5 years ago. He was too far from his office in New Delhi and missed the hustle and bustle of his architectural firm. As Meena maneuvered through the city, she recalled a conversation with Madhav Behera, that's the industrialist, soon after they had moved to Sompur. He said the industrialist behind Behera House could not understand why she, Meena, would refuse a car and a driver. But even at 30, Meena was not confident behind the wheel, and surely would have benefited. But no self-respecting social activist would dare to be seen in a chauffeured Mercedes. Behera finally gave in, but not without some stern advice. Meena, he said, Sompur is not New Delhi. If you insist on driving, please remember to leave your manners at the door. To get anywhere, you must act as if you owned the road. And don't forget, the streets have their own caste system. Oversized lorries and sacred cows are the Brahmins. Don't mess with them. Then come the Mercedes and other luxury automobiles, the Kshatriya warriors. After that, you have the Marutis and all the other mid-size and low-priced cars. They're like the Vaishya farmers. Finally, the Shudras, the bottom feeders, common scooters and rickshaws. Everything else on two wheels or legs is untouchable. Meena remembered shuddering at the word untouchable, which nobody used anymore. But as a new hire, she was too shy to speak up. You must know your place in the pecking order, Behera continued. Yield to those above you, negotiate with your equals, and sit on your horn to blow everyone else out of the water. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of her inner dialogue as she's driving home at the beginning of the novel.
Why don't we get a sense of Keish, if you can do that? As you say, he's a complex character, and one way, and he's going to put some people off.
Oh, definitely. So
without
finally, she does get home. She gets home, and Keish looks up from the dining room table and says, "What took you so long?" Keish barked. "You're 2 hours late." Meena walked into the dining room, cringing at his sharp tone. Her husband was already seated at the dinner table, puffing a gulwaz and nursing a bourbon. With a deep frown, he leaned against the tall back of the wooden chair carved with frolicking elephants, their thick trunks wrapped around blossoming trees. Dressed in a white kurta, embroidered with flowers around the neck and sleeve, Keish was beginning to look like his father, the former Maharaja of a small princely state tucked into the Himalayan foothills. "Sorry, Keish, there was a terrible accident on MG Road. I wanted to call, but I left my mobile at the office." She planted a kiss on his cheek and headed to the bathroom. "A young boy was hit and killed by a lorry." Oh, I'm sorry. She says, "A young boy was hit and killed by a lorry, which swerved to dodge a goat," Keish added. "Pardon? A goat," he called after her. "There are more goats than people in Sompur. The ratio is 12.5 to 1. I read an article by Professor Billy Gotra at Sompur Technical College. Get it? Billy Gotra? Anyway, what else do I have to do in Sompur, the armpit of the world? My office in Delhi seems to be running just fine without me." "Sorry, dear," Meena called out as she dried her hands. "What did you say?" Keish raised his voice. "I said, what else do I have to do in this armpit of the world? Well, I suppose India's got a lot of armpits, since every bloody deity has 10 arms. So that's just a taste of Keish, of the one side of Keish.
Well, why don't we get, because I do want to get to the writing of this novel, but maybe you could just give us a couple of others. I'm thinking of, at least of Simon, who is the American architect. And we should say, I don't know if we said right at the beginning, you're coming with a great deal of experience in green architecture. So a lot of what you are writing from about Simon is coming from a lot of knowledge that you have about sustainable architecture.
Yeah, and it also, I worked a lot. My company that I had, this international green building company, was focused mostly on international projects. And one saw some pretty, some real shenanigans, for lack of a better word, in what the real estate developers were trying to do to get certified, green building certification in countries like India and China. And there was also a lot of tension between the green building, the people who in a country like China and India who wanted to go forward with green buildings, and the traditional industries, which knew they would lose a lot of business if green building practices became prevalent. So I try to bring all that into the novel. But Simon, let's go to Simon. He's an architect, as we've said, but he's also very reflective. He's also very romantic. At one point, when he just meets Meena, and Meena lists the industries that Mr. Behera is engaged in, and they include very polluting industries like coal-fired power plants and mining. He says to himself, these are some of the worst polluting companies for the environment. But from her fulsome lips, it was as if all the bad stuff had been filtered out. If you don't mind, Merle, I'd like to read you a passage where Simon is actually reflecting on a trip that they took to the temple. There's a local temple. And it gives you a sense of how he's thinking in the end, if I can find it. Well, maybe I won't read you that passage. 1 second, page 91. Okay, so in this passage, Simon lay in bed that evening. This was after Case had brought him, this is the first day he arrives in India to do this design or to talk to people about the design, what they want. And Case brings him to the project site, but also to the local temple where to meet this really crazy, this baddie priest that runs the temple. And maybe if we have time, we can talk about him later, but I doubt there will be time. As Simon lay in bed that evening, the strange visit to the temple played over and over in his mind. Case and the priest were surely carved out of the same stone. Upi, that's the nickname of the priest. Upi was like a busy Hindu temple, teeming not with erotic friezes, but with wild notions and erotic poems. Just as the temple's busy architecture was meant to overwhelm its devotees, Upi himself overwhelmed. He was, as he called himself jokingly, a chief overwhelming officer, a COO. How different India was from his beloved China, where temples expressed a universal beauty and harmony, the emptiness of Buddhism. How could he possibly design a community center for Meena's women? How could he express the Hindu sense of life's fullness and still convey peace and tranquility, a healing quality, a sense of being overwhelmed in a good way?
But these are just, these are glimpses, of course, just to give a sense of the writing, which is a segue for me to, to talk about the writing. I mean, this, which I think would interest a lot of people who are here, in the way that you got started. I mean, you hadn't written any extended piece before. I know that you were writing some short stories, but this was a large undertaking. Which I remember very well. And so maybe you could talk about how you got into doing that, how this came about.
Well, my first impulse was to I'd always kept journals in India. And my first impulse was to take this pile of journals that I had on my bookshelf, collecting dust for so many years, and go through them and simply pick out some of the most interesting experiences that I've had in India over the years living there, and sort of string them together, figure out a plot and string them together, almost like an Indian garland. You create a garland out of all these different flowers. Well, I got my journals together, I put them on my desk, and I started writing. And 4 years later, and 312 or 18 pages later, I hadn't opened up one journal. So, I started thinking it was just going to be this collection of journal experiences, but clearly I had a lot in my head that I wanted to get out. I really didn't know it would turn into a novel that would be, saleable, but I enjoyed writing it, and in a way, I was able, by doing this, to find some thread of continuity, even though it was fictitious. Most of the events in the novel didn't happen to me, but I was able to still find a way to thread it all together. And, I guess if I were on a psychiatrist's couch, I'd hear him say or her say, it is you. I mean, at some deeper level, what you write is part of your experience.
It's part of your experience, but you're also creating a fiction,
Yeah.
and you're creating a narrative, and you're creating characters. And
Right.
this was not something you had done before. So did it just come naturally? Keats says poetry should come as naturally as leaves on the tree, or not come at all. But he never talked about the revision. The initial writing may have just come out, as it does for many
Right.
writers, but then in fiction,
That's the hard part.
you're shaping, and you're having to condense. And
That's the hard part. And that's really where the Writer's Center came in, Merrill. From the Writer's Center, I took many, many workshops at the Writer's Center as I was writing this novel. And there I learned about things that really I had no idea about, which are truly essential in writing a novel. Things like the point of view and not switching point of views every other sentence. I learned that you have to have the conflict pretty close up front. I mean, you don't have to have a lady tied to the train tracks on the first page, but you better be there on the second or third page. I learned that you're not writing Moby Dick. You shouldn't go off on tangents for 20, 30 pages, which I had done in my original draft, which was 700 pages. I think the biggest thing was editing, learning that I had to edit. And it was hard. I felt like, after I had a first draft, I felt like, Abraham with the knife over his kid, his toddler. And people were saying, cut, stab, and I just couldn't do it. And that's how you feel as a writer, at least a first time writer, because everything you write, you think is God's gift to the world. But I bit the bullet, and I was able to cut massive amounts out. Fortunately, because of word processors, one can still, keep them somewhere in space.
so were you bringing pieces of the novel to the workshops? I mean, what kind of workshop?
We did that too. But I want to say one more thing about the workshops. And I think this is the most important thing, and it's the camaraderie. Writing, as everyone knows, and especially those who are listening today who are writers themselves, writing is a very, very lonely experience. And there's nothing like getting together once a week with other writers and sharing work and sharing challenges. There's no price tag one can put that isn't too high that one can put on that experience. And that's something the Writer's Center gives all of us. Sorry.
Did you in part, this is not quite a rhetorical question, because I know that you have, but you had some outside assistance in editing. What was the nature of some of that kind of help that you had?
Well, in addition to the Writer's Center, I dug into my pockets and paid a few what they call manuscript consultants, writers, people who are professional writers who had published, who would read the manuscript and make suggestions. And these suggestions, these very specific suggestions from people who read the whole manuscript and could see the whole, not just pieces like an instructor or somebody in a workshop could do, but could see how the whole thing fits together, the whole shape of the novel. It was invaluable.
One of the
my wife also, she was very good at criticizing me. And in fact, I'll tell you, and this is good advice for any man writing a novel, you have to show it to women because women's point of view is very different from men's point of view. And I mean, that sounds obvious, but it wasn't to me. And I had to change so much about Keisha's behavior, for example, as well as others characters in the novel, so that it wouldn't turn women off. And in fact, my original novel was Simon was the protagonist, and it was only after I had my first draft that I realized that, first of all, that the people who read novels are largely women, and one has to write to women. And so it became necessary for me, or I felt it was necessary, to go through the novel and give Meena a much stronger voice. And after many, many attempts at revising some of the chapters, she became not only a co-protagonist, but probably the main protagonist.
Are you able to give us one example of Jen, your wife's criticism? I don't know if that's a hardball question or not, but she, I know that she went through this, through the novel.
Well, I don't know if this is Jen's, but I'll read you a short, well, I keep saying everything is short, but it's really not so short. A passage where Keish is kind of, you might say, at his worst. But it also is very revealing in another way, and we'll see why at the end. In this passage, in this passage, Keish and Simon, as I mentioned, this is the first day Simon is in India. And Keish has taken him to the project site and to meet this priest at the temple. And they're talking in the car. Keish is driving. And they're talking about domestic violence and what's the root of domestic violence, because that's, you know, the theme, which is this whole commission project centers around. And Keish says, in any case, I have a better than the Hindu party's harebrained plan of turning back the clock on women, or on domestic violence. I say we move the clock forward with genetic engineering. What? Says Simon. Genetic engineering. Let modern science do the job. Do what job? Get rid of all the domestic violence in this bloody country. I say we give women a few genes from randy elephants, and if they don't grow trunks, they'll be stronger than bulls. Hubbies won't dare pick a fight. Well, there's a politically correct solution, says Simon. Who cares so long as it works? Do you have a better way to stop millions of men who have nothing better to do than to beat their wives into pancake batter, or still worse, throw acid in their pretty faces? How to respond? Keish seemed to really care about the issue, but his solution was, well, asinine. Still, Keish was beginning to detect a pattern. He would babble on about some serious topic and then top it off with a joke, often one in very bad taste. Or, as in this case, he would just come up with some extraordinary sentence, statement, however politically incorrect. Was Keish's humor a coping mechanism? A way of dealing with the ugly realities of life in India? Just maybe underneath all the shit was a man who was truly tormented by the suffering around him. They finished lunch and drove to the project site. As soon as the car reached a terrifying speed, Keish started in where he'd left off. In Sanskrit poetry, women's tapering legs are often likened to elephants, so we're halfway home. Pardon? The elephant gene, genetic engineering, remember? Come on, Keish, get real. Listen, 365 million years ago, some wretched fish had a stunted fin, which got passed on genetically and eventually led to the development of land-dwelling creatures with limbs, a hellbenter or some such slimy thingamajig. Anyway, a few seconds later, in evolutionary time, we humans pop up. We're all just a bundle of gene mutations, so what's so bad about manipulating another gene or two if it's for the good of mankind? Well, actually, womankind. You aren't kidding, are you, Keish? Sure, it sounds like we're treating women like cattle. Well, pachyderms. But if it stops violence, who cares? So you see what's going on here. He's so politically incorrect. It's not even, funny. But at the same time, Simon's right that he is very much pained by what he sees around him. And, if I have anything to say about it as the author, I would say he uses it as a defense mechanism.
No, that's good. Well, we're coming towards the end.
Yeah, maybe we should
I wonder
break for some questions.
if anybody has any questions or observations.
Yeah, there's one question that came in already in the chat a little bit earlier, so I will read it out now. Do you have any recommendations on keeping a journal? How they can feed a writer's creativity?
Well, my only recommendation is to find a quiet time that's the same every day where you sit with your journal and don't make it so difficult that you won't do it. You know, don't make it like an hour of your day. Make it 5 or 10 minutes. But like meditating or anything else, start slow and just sit there. And if you don't write anything, that's okay as well, as long as you're sitting there, because it will come and you will write eventually. And of course, as everybody says in giving advice about journals, don't worry what you're writing. It's for you and only you. Just write what comes and don't worry about it polishing it. Don't worry about what people will think of it. Write from your heart. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Merrill, do you want to add anything to that?
Well,
Merrill's a big journal.
I've been keeping journals since the late 60s. I mean, it can be overwhelming because it's hard to go back to them. But for me, it's one of the things that Ken is saying, and I think any writer who is keeping a journal. There are some writers that don't want to keep journals because who I've read, because it takes that energy out of them. For me, it's an energy drive. The first thing I do in the morning, in a cup of coffee and sitting down at my journal with whatever is there, and you follow it along, and sometimes it'll break out into lines of a poem, but often it doesn't. But at least in a sense, it's feeding the beast. You've written, and for whatever the reason is, it's calming because what you're doing is you're exploring, and you don't know what you don't know what you're going to find or what's going to rise up. And again, I'm not saying anything unusual. I read writers on journals, and I'm not repeating them. I'm speaking from experience with. I'm sitting in this room with about 125 journals, these black and white marbleized journals. At any rate, then we had a question here. I saw somebody raise their hand.
Oh yeah, there's one just got typed in. Ken, can you talk about the writing and rewriting of this novel?
I can only say that it's hard. I mean, I don't know how many drafts, I didn't count, but I must have rewritten this thing 100 times. And if you're a perfectionist, you want every single sentence to be perfect or as perfect as you can make it. And so it can become a very long and tedious part of the whole process, but it's necessary. I spent more time editing the novel than I did writing the novel. But in the end, I have to say, when you look back, and I feel very happy with it, very proud of what I've done. So, it's like anything, like learning an instrument, learning the piano. You work hard, but in the end, when you can play that Moonlight Sonata, there ain't nothing like it. Oh.
I just tossed in a follow-up on mine. Like, what was the time frame? So from word one of the novel to
well, I sold my company in 2010. Well, 2008, but I had to be with the company for a few years after that. But I was sort of extricated in 2010, and it was just finished in 2020. But that's not to say I worked on it the whole time. I think if I got very not bored, but at times it was just overwhelming me. It was too much, and I had to put it down. So there were a few years I didn't work on it, and then other years where I worked on it only, for an hour or two a day. I would say if you added it all up, it might have been 3 or 4 years, but it was within a decade of, in terms of a time span.
So are you going to take on another one, Ken?
Well, we'll see how this one flies.
Good. I might say this is probably, this is me putting in a plug. You can, if you're interested in the novel, of course you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but you can also go to dryadpress.com, and there's no postage. So there's my little bit of promotion.
Yes. Yes.
Well, and
Please,
if any of you do read it, please give us your feedback. I mean, I consider you all friends now that we've spent an hour together. We would love to hear from you.